I am Trent Groves. I will be your moderator here today, but a couple of things before we get started. If you are here for the Gungahlin Horticultural Society Bonsai and Topiary workshop, that is down the hall to the left. If you are here to learn and about a professional body of knowledge, then you're in the right place. Second point, although this might be session 1B, you have made the correct choice because we have assembled the A class of panel today. So if I could just take some time to introduce them to you. So to start with, we have Professor Craig Stockings. Craig is a Professor of History and Head of School, Humanities and Social Sciences at UNSW, Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. His areas of academic interest concern general and Australian military history and operational analysis. He has published widely in the field of 20th century military history with a focus on Australian experiences of war. Craig is concurrently appointed by the Australian Government as the official historian of Australian operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and Australian peacekeeping operations in East Timor from 1999 to 2014. The first 6 volumes of this series were published in 2022 and 4 other volumes are completed and awaiting clearance. And one thing that you may not know about Professor Stockings, in his spare time he is learning the piccolo. We also have on our panel today Dr. Jordan Beavis. Dr. Beavis is an academic research officer at the Australian Army Research Centre, having formerly worked as a researcher for the Australian War Memorial's official history of the Australian operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. His research focuses on the militaries of the British Empire and the Commonwealth in the interwar period, international engagement, professional military education and mobilisation. He is currently the Australian Army Research Centre's research lead for the State of the Army Profession Research Priority. Another fun fact about Jordan is in his spare time he is learning to ride the unicycle. Our final presenter today is Dr. Darren Moore. Dr. Moore graduated from the Australian Defence Force Academy in 1990 and the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1991. He is also a graduate of the Australian Command and Staff College Joint. He served in the Australian Army until 2005. Highlights of his military service include operational deployments to Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste and serving for 2.5 years between 2001 and 2003 with the United States Army on an army-to-army exchange. His first book, Duntroon, the Royal Military College of Australia, 1911 to 2001, was published in 2001. His second, The Soldier, A History of Courage, Sacrifice and Brotherhood, was published in 2009. His PhD thesis examined the impact of technology over the last 2 centuries on the burdens faced by soldiers. So clearly you all agree with me that we have assembled a great panel for you to understand learning and the professional body of knowledge that it takes to be in the Army. So to start with, I'm going to invite Professor Stockings to discuss with us, remember who you are, the Army profession and what it requires you to know. Craig.
Thank you, Trent. One and all, I'll bring the piccolo with me next time. Before I begin, I can't see a thing with the lights up the back there, so if it feels like I'm looking in a sort of hazy way too, it's because I can't see it all. Pull as many faces as you like. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm honoured to be with you here today to share my thoughts on education and the profession of arms, or the Army profession in contemporary parlance, and what that might mean for today's Army. Let me say at the very outset, as an academic, I give dozens of speeches each year, probably too many for long-suffering audiences, but this one is important. The opportunity to talk to you, to reach out to you, perhaps challenge you, at the very least seek to get you thinking on what I believe are an important set of intellectual issues, is a rare privilege. My thanks again to Chief of Army in his absence and all those involved today. It is my purpose this morning to talk about the interface between education and the concept of an army profession, for the two really are inseparable. My contention, though, is army and defence writ large has not traditionally managed this interface well. So channeling a bit of Chris Smith here as well at the same time. I'm going to try to explain why. I'm going to posit some ideas about how this might be reversed. But I don't need you to agree with me. I'd be disappointed if you did. I'd much prefer to inspire some pushback, some debate. No one learns much through meek acquiescence. Forgive me then if from time to time I err on the side of the provocative. To begin, the concept of an army profession is reasonably widely accepted and use of the term is increasingly common within your army context. Yet I think paradoxically, this idea that remains surprisingly ill-defined and poorly understood. In a philosophical or abstract sense, like all professions, that of arms requires a special set of knowledge and skills unique to itself. It does not matter what career stage someone might be in within any given profession. The key point is that all members must have a foundational knowledge and education in the central purpose of that profession. This is a unifying start point for the development of more specialised expertise later on. For example, be you a High Court judge, be you a newly graduated legal assistant, you have both been through an educational experience that laid the foundations of professional knowledge. And that body of knowledge was set by the profession, not by educational providers like universities. The key question then is what type and/or body of knowledge, what type of education is both essential and applicable for the professional conduct of land warfare. Well, it's interesting to note, one and all in this regard, that much of a conception between the link between Army's purpose and its profession, and all of that entails, is in fact underpinned by a set of lectures by an Australian-born British officer, General Sir John Winthrop Hackett, one-time commander of the British Army on the Rhine, with parallel command of NATO's Northern Army Group, some 63 years ago. Despite the time, Hackett's views, to me, remain valid. Critically, he argued for the importance of understanding war. Let me say that again, of understanding war as an essential and core component of real and substantive membership into the army profession. That is why understanding the theories of warfare, its nature and its character must be the profession's primary competence. Hackett's call has resonated to some extent within most of the armies of the Anglosphere. The need for deep education into the nature of war was echoed recently, for example, by General James Mattis, former US Secretary of Defence and a four-star Marine officer who commanded in both Iraq and Afghanistan. By reading, Mattis tells us, you learn through others' experiences generally a better way to do business, especially in our kind of work where the consequences of incompetence are so final. Winging it, Mattis continues, and filling body bags as we sort out what works reminds us of the moral dictates and the cost of incompetence in our profession. It's to this idea that my talk is centred. Now let me ask you some questions if I may. I've introduced the idea of an army profession, and I'm sure those of you in uniform in front of me here see yourself as part of it. But what does this mean for you personally in the conduct of your day-to-day business? From the outside looking in, let me observe, you are not business managers. You are not administrators. You are not CEOs or board members or committee secretariats, human resource managers, Senate estimates, brief writers, accountants, project supervisors, OH&S delegates, PR officers, spin doctors, or any other agents of the minutiae of the bureaucratic process. These may be the things you do, they cannot be who you are. For you are this nation's sword and its shield, your singular purpose. Beyond the bureaucratic or administrative malaise you may wade through in Russell or elsewhere on any given day is to fight and win the next war. Nothing more, nothing less. You can't use side of this. This is your profession. The rest is chaff. Some of it might be actually necessary or important, but it's chaff nonetheless. Deep, lived, wholehearted commitment to your own identity, who you really are, is the first brick in building an army profession. If, as Hackett suggests, the critical and central element of that profession is indeed a deep understanding of the nature and character of war, then there are perhaps some serious questions to be asked about how effective is professional education really within today's army. As official historian of operations in the Middle East and East Timor, I have had the privilege of devoting myself for more than a decade to a deep study of your army and operations since 1999. In this context, it is clear to me the absolute best of those soldiers, non-commissioned officers, junior and senior commanders in all three theatres have always been the smartest. Or perhaps that's the wrong word, rather the best educated, not by fancy testament, not by fancy school, but by their knowledge of warfare, their mastery of that profession. Let me go one step further, become perhaps a little bit more controversial. Those most successful in army, in war and warlike operations, in the last 2 decades have never been the strongest, or the fittest, or the best marksmen, or those with a rote memory of doctrine or Russell's administrative processes. Rather, it's been those with mental agility, those with the familiar with disparate cultural and historical context of the war they're in, those able to juggle competing perspectives, to work without concrete guidance, to solve problems on their own, to be able to form their own conclusions based on evidence and observation, to be comfortable working with strategic and even tactical ambiguity. Because there are no formulas for success on the battlefield, ancient or modern. Both history and the origins of strategic thought teaches this. The important point here is that all those characteristics I just listed, all those attributes, not coincidentally correspond precisely with the very purpose and inherent requirements of a military-oriented education. Well, those philosophical discussions are well and good, but where, may you ask, is the evidence? To answer this, I again fall back on the process of researching and writing the official histories. It is clear to me, across all rank levels, multiple theatres, tasks, threat levels, combat intensities, and a myriad of other circumstances between 1999 and 2014, that gaps in military education have been exposed. These gaps or shortcomings have had real operational consequences for individuals, groups and task units. Such education-based knowledge gaps have been most manifest in certain individuals and groups I've studied by the following: a profound discomfort with ambiguity or the unknown, and a consequent thirst or even a craving for clarity in operations that will never come. A strong drive to control situations and environments that will not submit to such control. Attempts to impose order and doctrine when both have been overtaken by events. An unwillingness more than an inability to change plans and accept risk in this regard. A lack of creativity. A lack of original thinking. A crisis of confidence, even self-doubt without clarity. A lack of mental flexibility. In summary, these difficulties represent either a lack of or a misunderstanding of the very nature of war and its inevitable demands. It is a capability unpreparedness. The irony is, of course, all of these challenges, all of these phenomena are not the product of any particular time, circumstance, theatre or context. War is always a creative act between human beings and inherently unpredictable. It's part of its nature. The oft-quoted seldom read Prussian makes it clear that war, for example, is a process, as Chris said, beset by fog and by friction. Quote, a realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in fog. So ambiguity regarding your own capability, adversaries' competence and intent during engagement, operation, campaign or even contact is ever present. It will always be ever present, despite the best efforts of intelligence services to impose an often artificial clarity. But the real point is this: if a lack of clarity has surprised anyone in a green uniform on operations in the last 20 years, this is an education gap. Moving from the realm of the mind to the realm of the physical. Nothing in war is simple, nor can it ever be so. There is a type of friction that makes the apparently easy things invariably difficult. Such friction isn't an object or a thing, but more of a condition. Marks a difference between conflict on paper and conflict in actuality. By definition then, friction also cannot be made to go away. Again, if this has been a revelation or a surprise to any soldier, any operation is an education failing. How well then, may I ask, are such basic educational foundational bricks understood by Army? I mean really understood. How well the rich, deep trove of military theory that has grown up alongside of and on top of foundations set by Clausewitz and his ilk really sunk in. I could ask who here has read on war, really read it, not quoted from it. Who has not heard of Jomini or Delbrook, Brodie, Caldwell, Mao, Mann, Corbett, Howard, Dewey? If there are any, I suspect there might be a few, perhaps more than a few. I ask you, how can this be? You of the Army profession must be familiar with the profession itself and constantly return to its body of knowledge to renew and refresh your understanding about the nature of warfare. To continue the analogy, I'm sure many of you could tell me all about the three parts of Clausewitz's famous Trinity, but how often do you actually take into account impacts of hatred and enmity, of friction and chance in the operations and the exercises you train for and conduct? This is the best model we have that makes warfare unique. Might it be the case over the last quarter centuries, and not just at the political level, lip service has been paid to such concepts as a whole? Does this help explain some of the difficulties of the period? In a similar vein, how many in this room or across Army more generally have had time or understanding or inclination for a deep consideration of the Indo-Pacific region? After all, this is your future battlefield. You know this. Some knowledge of human, physical, cyber terrain, for example, military capabilities or force structures and so on must be useful. Operations in the Middle East showed us how hard it was to build up such knowledge on the run. Well, here's the chance. How can Army not want to know its battlefield in detail, inside and out, in advance? What of a deep study of operations that are ongoing across the globe in places like Ukraine, Houthi operations against shipping, the civil war in Myanmar, the resilience of Islamic State? How much does Army as a whole, as an institution, know of these issues beyond sporadic media reporting? How many in this room? This is perhaps the future of warfare unfolding, where conflicts demonstrate adaptive ecosystems as technologies are tested, refined, scaled and put into practice within days. How can such things not be part of a professional military education on a regular basis? What might be learned? How long we've been sending young men, young women into harm's way without such basic educational concepts? If so, for how long? And how happy is Army with this state of affairs? I might add, all of these uncertainties I've mentioned have unfolded since the turn of the century, where Army has had complete intelligence preponderance, complete firepower and logistics dominance. It is worth considering that a peer enemy, by its own intent, training and doctrine, will impose levels of fog, friction and disjunction orders of magnitude greater with those with whom the Australian Army has vied against for the last 25 years. What then? Being well trained without being well educated is simply insufficient. Just as surely as the reverse, a soldier can no more function at peak effectiveness in modern warfare without an education into his or her profession, that is, a deep understanding of the nature and conflict and conduct of warfare, than he or she can deploy without training on the use of their weapon. Once again, let's listen to James Mattis. Thanks to his own self-directed education into the nature of war, he writes, and I'm quoting, "I have never been caught flat-footed in any situation, never at a loss with how any problem has been addressed successfully or unsuccessfully before. It doesn't give me all the answers, but it often lights what is a dark path ahead." Ultimately, he concludes, a real understanding of warfare, quote, means we face nothing new under the sun. Let me change tack. It is, of course, a truism that senior Army officers began their careers as juniors. It seems self-evident, therefore, that properly educating junior officers in the Army profession is important, and Army has historically recognised this at some level, even if it's subconscious. The first tertiary degree programs began at Duntroon, for instance, way back in the 1968 academic year, and the tradition continued from 1986 at ADFA and continues to this day. The important question in this context then is not what is the value of a university education, but what type of education is most important for the profession of arms. The answer must be that type that optimally prepares young officers for war, not which best prepares them for their next career, or that which is most easy, convenient, or cheapest to be taught. This issue kind of brings us back to where I started. In my own view, tertiary education of any sort does bring tangible operational benefits to all members, regardless of rank. This is the development of critical thinking, of imaginative thinking patterns. This is the provision of knowledge and insight. These are the only tools at hand when training and formulaic solutions are not enough. I reiterate, so long as the purpose of the profession is to prosecute war, then training and doctrine, as valuable as they are, will never be enough. Strategic theorists have explained this truism to us time and again, and the last 25 years have only proven these precepts as timeless. When ambiguity and confusion reign, when things are not going to plan, when unforeseen situations arise, when decisions need to be made in the moment, all that is left are the instincts of the heart and the mind. These are the imprints of education. As valuable as education is in the abstract, though, I think it is much more powerful still when it is designed and delivered within a specific context of a profession. That is, with an applied purpose in mind. This concept isn't new. Medical students are educated, for instance, not solely with a focus on abstract biology, but with an emphasis on the human body. Budding lawyers are taught not only the theories and philosophies of the law, but how these have been applied to real legal matters. Engineers study the application of science technology, not its abstraction. That is, education in these examples is provided within the context of the profession and always with the purpose of that profession's core mission in mind. This does not happen often in a military educational context in Australia. An army, to me, is the poorer for it. There is no reason why army can't have its cake and eat it too. For all the benefits and significance of education in its own right, disconnected from the job at hand, it can only go so far. A more purposely designed education in the army profession, studying the theory and application of war and warfare, would add so much more. At this point, please allow me to acknowledge the recent work that DCA flagged at Chief of Army's behest throughout Army Headquarters and Forces Command to initiate the new degree at ADFA in 2027, a Bachelor of War Studies. Exactly the type of focused, professionally relevant education I've been talking about thus far. Perhaps in time, this essential first educational brick might be available for more than just a small proportion of ADFA's Army class. Perhaps it could be extended, not necessarily as a degree across Army's junior cohort writ large, perhaps to all ranks. One day promotion even might be contingent on mastering this first brick of professional education. This feels kind of like PME Nirvana to me. But to return to script, other professions do not allow their internal external education institutions to deviate too much from core professional business. The Australian Medical Council's purpose, for instance, is to ensure the standards of education for doctors are appropriate. For lawyers, the Council of Australian Law Deans does the same, as does Engineers Australia for engineering degrees. From an Army perspective, though, until now, the professionals have seemed remarkably silent. I hope you remain silent no more. I hope the new degree at ADFA is a sign of more to come, an education where learning outcomes have been set by you, the profession, not by the university, a degree to which I ought to be held accountable year by year to make sure it aligns with the needs of your profession. To conclude then, at the end of the day, Army has long pronounced its most important assets are its people. This also signalled a dedication to the Army profession. At the heart of that profession is education. Most importantly, this means education for all members into the nature and conduct of war. This is Army's reason to exist. Not management, not business administration, not the tangent, but the real task at hand. I think there's still a gap in this regard, but a confluence of opportunity as well. Let me finish, ladies and gentlemen, with this final thought. Army's future wars may not always be conflicts of choice. Moreover, in a fight for survival, then the technological advantage, our security blanket for so long, may be rudely yanked aside. In such cases, where is the Australian Army's critical edge if it's not its size or its technology? The answer must be its mind. Investment in this capability by our adversaries and potential enemies in professional education is not being pursued as quickly as they seek technological panaceas. This is an opportunity then to gain advantage in the intellectual element of fighting power, to create soldiers, to create officers who can conceive of and execute solutions to military problems we haven't even thought about yet. Prioritising education into the nature and conduct of war, the profession, is therefore not discretionary. It's essential. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Hey, thank you very much, Professor Stockings. I know I won't be alone in saying that I'm glad there was a bunch of rhetorical questions there because you had me at bureaucratic malaise and the chaff that I need to get rid of. But to be honest, how many of us have practiced the friction that's spoke about by Clausewitz? I'm glad I was able to sit there and not have to answer that directly to you. But I look forward to the questions that's going to generate. So thank you very much, Professor Stockings. Next up, we have Dr. Jordan Beavis, and he will be talking to us on the Army profession and specifically history of the Australian Army Journal and how it supports our profession.
Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, friends and colleagues. Before I commence my remarks today, I must note that this presentation reflects only the views of myself as an academic research officer and not necessarily those of the Australian Army Research Centre where I work and or the Department of Defence or the Defence Force. I'd also like to extend my appreciation to my colleagues in the ARC for their support in preparing my remarks today. Today, I'll explore the history of a notable periodical. For 58 years and in 4 different iterations, the Australian Army Journal, or AAJ, has served as the professional journal of the Australian Army. Throughout this period, its core mission has remained remarkably consistent. It exists to support the professionalism of Army's personnel, enhance their understanding of the military arts and sciences, and intellectually equip them for contemporary and future challenges. Yet its history has at times been an unhappy one. Published internally by the Army, the journal's fortunes have waxed and waned with the institution's changeable priorities. Its presence within Army's intellectual landscape is mixed, and its success in achieving its mission has often been highly dependent on the fluctuating buy-in of senior officers and other senior leaders. and the willingness of Army personnel for whom the journal is maintained to contribute to its pages. Now, in its fourth iteration, the AAJ is published 3 times a year by the Australian Army Research Centre, a directorate within AHQ's Future Land Warfare branch. Its content is a mix of contributions from Army's professionals, defence public servants, and external academics on a wide array of topics related to the Army profession, the exercise of Australian land power, and warfare in the land domain. The history of the Australian Army Journal has been one of support to the Army profession. I'll commence my presentation today with a brief review of the importance of journals to professions, especially on the critical functions performed by military journals for the military professions. I'll then briefly survey the history of the journal's 4 iterations and then conclude my remarks with some comments on the future of the AAJ. The critical role of professional periodicals has been well established in the sociological study of professions. In 1933, Alexander Carr Saunders and Paul Wilson, pioneers in the modern study of professions, argued that publication of a journal was indispensable to the collection and maintenance of the special knowledge required of a profession. In 1988, noted sociologist Andrew Abbott suggested that the maintenance of a professional journal was a key indicator of a modern profession. Such journals, he continued, constituted a professional work site, critical in the purely professional work of maintaining and furthering professional knowledge. Such arguments have been echoed in the study of military professions. In his famous treatise, The Soldier and the State, Samuel P. Huntington stated that professional knowledge was intellectual in nature and capable of preservation in writing, with contact between the academic and practical sides of profession being maintained through the pages of devoted journals. More recently, Nathan W. Toronto has suggested that military periodicals fulfill 3 key functions for the forces that maintain them. They suggest a commitment to the production of a military-specific body of knowledge. They serve as a forum for the cultivation and dissemination of such knowledge, and provide a venue to develop a culture of reflection on the military challenges of the day. Professional military journals are also a means of maintaining awareness of ongoing professional debates. Even while serving as Supreme Allied Commander Europe in 2009-13, Admiral James Stavridis dedicated himself to reading an article or 2 each night to maintain his awareness of ongoing debates in the US Army's Military Review or the US Naval War College's proceedings. The genesis of the Australian Army's first professional journal is easy to identify. In his 1910 Memorandum on the Defence of Australia, Field Marshal Viscount Herbert Kitchener advised the Australian government that Army headquarters should develop and publish a military magazine and issue it free to the Commonwealth military officers to support their study of military subjects. Kitchener's suggestion was rapidly taken up, and in April 1911, the first edition of the Commonwealth Military Journal, or CMJ, was published by the General Staff's Training Branch. In the introduction to this first edition, Director of Military Training, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Wilson, declared that the primary purpose of the new publication was to assist officers in studying their profession. And this was to be achieved by supporting contributions to the journal by Australians and by reprinting articles of interest from foreign service magazines. Published from April 1911 to January 1916, the CMJ was a short-lived initiative, but a tangible indicator of the ongoing push for the professionalisation of the Australian military forces prior to the First World War. A total of 32 editions of the CMJ was produced, 25 under the title of Commonwealth Military Journal and 17 as the Australian Military Journal after it was renamed in July 1914 to reflect the legislated change of the Army's title from the Commonwealth Military Force to the Australian Military Forces. During its existence, the journal published original articles by Australian contributors, transcripts of speeches and lectures, articles from foreign journals, and military notices largely drawn from the British Army Review. Only 56% of the articles published in the CMJ over the course of its existence were original contributions, but this nonetheless represents a body of original Australian military literature. Contributions came from both citizen officers and permanent soldiers, with some of the contributors including 2 future Chiefs of the General Staff, Brudnell White and Walter Coxon, and a number of individuals who rose to prominence in the Australian Imperial Force in the First World War, such as Charles Brand, Cecil Foote, and John Monash. In 1913, a dedicated editor was appointed to the journal for the first time. The advertisement of this position attracted over 60 applications from around Australia, including one from Andrew Banjo Patterson, a journalist and war correspondent turned farmer. Amid a range of excellent applications for the position, Defence Minister George Pearce selected a fellow Western Australian for the role, Captain Roland Garland. Garland served as the CMJ's only editor, overseeing its production until Pearce announced its cessation in February 1916 on the basis that there was little need for the publication, as Australian military personnel were then practising war in real time. Following the First World War, several half-hearted attempts were made to revive the Commonwealth Military Journal. Yet it was only in the aftermath of the Second World War that such proposals began to gain traction. In October 1945, Deputy Chief of the General Staff, Major General John Chapman, went so far as to order costings to be prepared for a revived journal. But the organisational turmoil of rapid demobilisation overtook this initiative and no progress was made. The series of events behind the release of the first edition of the Australian Army Journal in 1948 have been well analysed elsewhere, including by Geoffrey Gray and Russell Parkin, and need not to be repeated in here. In short, however, the AAJ represented an initiative of Vice Chief of the General Staff, Major General Sidney Rowell, and a public servant within the AHQ's Directorate of Military Training, Eustace Graham Keogh. With the support of Lieutenant General Vernon Sturdy, the Chief of the General Staff, Rowell and Keogh followed a Canadian precedent and converted the monthly issued Army Training Memorandum into a professional journal, the AAJ. The fourfold aims of this new publication were noted by Keogh in the first edition of this journal and appear on my slide, the sum total of which constitutes a mission statement on how the AAJ would support the Army in the development and maintenance of professional expertise. As with the Commonwealth Military Journal, the AAJ was to be issued free of charge to all officers and cadet officers in the Australian Military Forces and was published internally by the Directorate of Military Training. For 17 years, Keogh served as the first editor of the AAJ, releasing 188 issues during this tenure. In this period, and with the support of key figures such as Rowell, the AAJ was embedded into the Army's institutional landscape. Its pages became a key forum for the study and debate of contemporary military challenges, and any analysis of the AAJ in the 1950s and 1960s shows an institution coming to grips with the effect of atomic weapons on land warfare, and one concerned with the development of best practice in jungle warfare and counterinsurgency operations. The AAJ also published educational material prepared by directorates within Army headquarters or by the editorial staff themselves. As with the CMJ, a lack of original content also necessitated reliance on reprinting articles from Foreign Service journals. In a remarkable degree of symmetry, only 57% of articles, excluding educational materials, speeches or book reviews, published in the first 50 essays of the AJ were original contributions, compared to 56% during the 5-year life of the CMJ. What this statistic does not capture, however, is that for the first time, original AAJ articles were themselves being republished overseas. In 1956, some 19 AAJ articles were reprinted in the United States Army's Military Review, India's Infantry Journal or Military Digest, South Africa's Commando, and other journals in Britain and Ireland. Thus, the AAJ served as a key connector between the Australian Army and other regional or partner militaries, and one deeply involved in the network transnational exchange of military literature. Keogh's departure as editor was a key moment in the evolution of the journal, and had his successors not been similarly capable editors, the AAJ could have easily collapsed into irrelevance. Instead, the journal's key role in supporting the Army profession continued and deepened. That the journal was valued by contemporaries is clear. Of 2,847 responses to a survey of the AAJ's readership in 1964 and 1965, some 92% of respondents found it to be an interesting publication, with 63% noting they garnered considerable information from it. Such a positive response was sincere encouragement, and during their tenures as editors, Bill Sweeting and Clem Cody sought to improve the AAJ in all of its aspects. After 1965, there was a significant reduction in the number of reprinted articles, with additional original contributions from a wider array of authors in Army, including staff cadets such as David Horner, Christopher Clark, and Peter Pedersen. Contributions from external academics and commentators were welcomed, and in response to criticism from outside authorities, the print quality and typeset were improved to render it more professional and modern. In August 1968, the AAJ was rebranded as the Army Journal, its national affiliation now only depicted through the inclusion of a map of Australia on its cover. As under Keogh, the journal continued to be a forum for the wide-ranging discussion of key matters of the day, including jungle warfare, counterinsurgency, organisational change, and in the 1970s, the role of women within Army. Unfortunately, the highly politicised nature of Army's involvement in the Vietnam War did affect the journal, however. Heightened sensitivity to potentially controversial content led to a degree of informal censorship, a source of frustration to editor Clem Cody, who sometimes unsuccessfully continued to fight for the pseudo-independence of the journal and the freedom of expression it had maintained up to that point. The journal continued publication after the end of Australia's involvement in Vietnam, and in the end, its own success led to its second death. In February 1976, the three Australian services were united into the Australian Defence Force. In order to support the intellectual development of this new force, the Army Journal, as the only professional military journal in routine publication in Australia, was selected for conversion into a new journal for the ADF as a whole, the Defence Force Journal. Therefore, in October 1976, after 28 years and 329 issues, the final edition of the Army Journal's second iteration was published, and it became no more, sacrificed for a larger professional purpose. Between 1976 and 1999, the Army relied upon the Defence Force Journal, supported by some core-level journals of varying quality, as its professional periodicals. By the late 90s, however, it had become clear that these were not sufficient. In 2004, Hugh Smith alleged that during its life, the Defence Force Journal had not lived up to being a quality journal, and that it had largely attracted few leading original thinkers or original analyses and was hardly read outside the Department of Defence. Amid a period of significant technological, doctrinal and strategic change, in 1999 the Australian Army was revived by the Force Development Group in Training Command and given a new subtitle, the Professional Journal of the Australian Army. Ultimately, however, this was just a soft reboot. Only 3 editions of this iteration of the AAJ were released between 1999 and 2002, and despite a number of quality contributions by notable authors, it failed to make much of an impact, as it lacked regularity in publication or wide distribution. Therefore, in 2002, Chief of Army Lieutenant General Peter Ley placed the publication in the hands of the Army's Land Warfare Studies Centre. Established in 1997, the Land Warfare Studies Centre was Army's internal think tank, and one whose charter specifically included the promotion of debate on issues related to Army and the exercise of land power. The LWSC then was well placed to publish a revived AAJ, and in 2003, Volume 1, Number 1 was released. In his introductory message to this edition, Peter Ley noted that it was his desire that the AAJ become a professional military journal whose intellectual content reflected our status as one of the world's leading armies. It is this iteration of the Army Journal which has remained in publication, with a 1-year hiatus in 2017. With a more academic style of publication and an editorial advisory board to oversee the selection of articles for publication, the current AAJ has achieved a substantially higher standard of contribution and debate than previous versions. It serves as Army's principal forum for evidence-based debate on a wide array of topics related to the exercise of Australian land power, with contributors including Army and Defence personnel, as well as external academics and commentators. No reprinting of articles from other publications is allowed, a policy for which there has only been one exception when, in 2008, the Chief of Army directed the rapid publication of a themed AAJ on counterinsurgency to inform urgent doctrine development. While maintaining a generally high standard, the AAJ has nonetheless faced a series of challenges in its past 22 years, beyond the perennial problem of securing sufficient contributions from Army's professionals. Since 2003, the AAJ has been published by 3 different authorities, generating inconsistency in its standard, editorial policies, publication schedule and practices. It is also unfortunate that over 22 years, the AAJ has had 19 different editors, managing editors and publishers, each of whom have had different responsibilities in the production of the journal. Among these, 3, Michael Evans, Catherine McGregor and Catherine McCullough, deserve commendation for their role in establishing, overseeing and producing the journal in its formative years. I will suggest that the AAJ has been at its most effective supporting the Army profession when it has had both organisational and editorial stability. Two factors which have contributed to its recent resurgence under its current publisher, the Australian Army Research Centre. Today, the AAJ is published 3 times a year, with 1 edition themed on an ARC research priority. All articles must pass through a double-blind peer review process and be accepted by the editorial advisory board to achieve publication. In terms of distribution, the journal is freely available online through the ARC's website, as well as through a limited internal hard copy distribution. It is currently being downloaded and read widely in Australia and internationally. What then is the future of the AAJ? It can be hoped that the journal will remain an enduring publication and continue to provide a forum for the rigorous debate of contemporary warfare in the land domain and the exercise of Australian land power generally. Should it do so, a range of suggestions can be offered. I've placed some of these on this slide. These range from maintaining the high standard of the journal, encouraging further contributions to it from Army personnel, and a suggestion that Army senior leadership should reaffirm the role and importance of the AAJ throughout the organisation, articulating the fundamental support it provides to the military profession in Australia and the importance of engaging with it regularly. For 58 years and in 4 iterations, the Australian Army Journal has supported the intellectual and professional development of Australia's soldiers. Its pages are a record of Army's history, tracing the great narrative arcs of the key strategic and defence issues of the day, a tangible indicator of how, as professionals, Army soldiers have contributed to their profession and a window into the Army's professional culture. It is hoped that the AAJ will remain in production either in its current form or an expanded one, but it should never again be allowed to disappear from Army's institutional landscape. Of past editions, a quote from Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness rings true. Not a very enthralling book, but at first glance you could see there a singleness of intention, an honest concern for the right way of going to work, which made these humble pages, thought out so many years ago, luminous with another than a professional light. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beavis. I must admit I can relate to the perennial problem of getting contributors to that journal, but one thing I wasn't aware of was the censorship over the Vietnam era, so I look forward to some of the questions that may generate in the Q&A topic. And that brings us to a theme that the Chief and the Deputy Chief spoke about, particularly we need to look back in order to understand the future. So I invite Dr. Darren Moore to come up and give us a historical perspective on bastardisation at the Royal Military College, Duntroon.
At the outset, I wish to acknowledge that some former cadets will have suffered and may continue to suffer psychological trauma arising from their treatment by their fellow cadets while at Duntroon. I hope that if they are listening to this presentation or even in the audience, that nothing I will say resurfaces this trauma or minimises the personal impact of what they may have experienced. My presentation will be in 3 parts. First, I'll provide some definitions of bastardisation and a broad taxonomy of behaviours that sit under this umbrella term. Next, I will take listeners for a whistle-stop tour of some 75 years of cadet misbehaviour, and I will then finish with some general commentary on the challenges that the Army has faced in addressing the scourge of bastardisation at Duntroon. Dr. Bruce Moore, no relation, a former lecturer in the English Department in the Faculty of Military Studies at Duntroon, in a lexicon of cadet language, devotes close to 9 pages in his discussion of bastardisation. He commences this detailed account with bastardisation being defined as the public's term for the unofficial initiation rites which 4th class cadets underwent during their induction to the college. Another definition comes to us via Lingo Lingo, which was published somewhat surreptitiously in 1987, and it defined bastardisation as for boys having fun, nothing whatsoever as harrowing as the press make out, simply character building. In my book titled The Soldier History of Courage, Sacrifice and Brotherhood, I examine the socialisation and indoctrination of civilians into the military. This process seeks to purge their civil identity, including any preconceptions they may have held about their rights and personal freedoms, and supplants the civilian value system with that of the military. This is accomplished by various methods, including denigrating those outside the military system and at the same time stressing the virtues of the military community. Other approaches are more individualised, relying on humiliation and brutality to break an individual's self-esteem, lower their resistance to the values and the attitudes that the military wants them to adopt, and reinforce the omnipotent nature of military discipline. A viewpoint largely shared by Professor Tom Frayne, who in 2017, in his book Widening Minds, the University of New South Wales and the Education of Australia's Defence Leaders wrote, the term bastardisation was imprecise and meant different things to different people. Bastardisation has been synonymous with senior classes imposing on junior classes additional duties, humiliating tasks and pointless exercises. It sometimes involved behaviour that amounted to common assault. The ostensible aim of these practices was to have the new entry cadets submit to institutional authority, demonstrate respect for seniority, and secure compliance to disciplinary codes. So where does that leave us? Was bastardisation youthful hijinks, or was it common assault? Did it have a role to play in the socialisation of new cadets, or was it simply humiliating and pointless, a public embarrassment for the Army, and a poor reflection upon the character of its perpetrators? Okay, to conclude the first part of my presentation, I will now introduce a broad taxonomy of bastardisation practices. First, rite of passage ceremonies, such as an initiation ceremony. Such ceremonies are applied indiscriminately against an entire subgroup of a population, the conclusion of which generally marks a passage of acceptance into the group with corresponding social benefits. Next, widespread but not always universal reinforcement of the social standing of a subgroup via humiliating and abusive practices, often wrapped up in the guise of establishing and reinforcing an institutional system of discipline. Finally, targeted and individualised sustained mistreatment, often but not always, perpetuated by members of a victim's own subgroup, with an intent of ostracisation and a sought outcome of a target individual exiting the subgroup, i.e. resigning from Duntroon. Next, I'll provide a summary of how bastardisation practices were established at Duntroon and became institutionalised. Although occasionally enforced into abeyance, usually as a result of external condemnation, they would re-emerge Hydra-like until the opening of the Australian Defence Force Academy in 1986. Following my graduation from Duntroon in 1991, I spent 10 years interviewing former graduates reaching back to the 1930s. As a general observation, while the graduates were all too ready to admit that they were aware of or were the recipients of bastardisation practices, rarely were they the perpetrators. As an historian, it was like grasping at smoke because, of course, no Duntroon training manual or official order ever set out the tenets and purpose of bastardisation. Indeed, the very opposite occurred. The founding Commandant, Brigadier Bridges, had written in the initial college orders, and you can see this on the slide, fagging or bullying by cadets is strictly prohibited and will be severely dealt with. Cadets will treat each other in terms of equality. No cadet is to perform any menial service for another cadet. Despite this order, bastardisation did become firmly entrenched at the college. The principal contributing factor to this was the college's class system, the senior class being the first class and the junior class being the fourth class. This class system equated seniority with privilege, as well as providing senior cadets the power to punish junior cadets. At Duntroon, like many other similar organisations of young men, a rite of passage was demanded. The purpose of this rite was to reinforce the distinction between the newly arrived and those that went before, that is, the more senior cadets. It usually consisted of new entrants proving a right of admittance to the organisation by undergoing a ritualised test, which generally involved a humiliation and reinforcement of the social hierarchy of the organisation. What was to become a common sequence of events throughout the college's history in relation to bastardisation scandals, an external party, in this instance a Sydney paper, published a report of a 1913 initiation ceremony, resulting in the Commandant being asked to investigate and report back to the Minister of Defence. Bridges detailed that he had not received any complaints concerning any discomfort or ill treatment arising out of the initiation ceremony. He concluded his remarks by stating that he was aware that an initiation ceremony had occurred, but that sort of thing was expected and was common with other similar institutions such as universities. Furthermore, as far as he was concerned, it was perfectly harmless and taken in good spirit by the so-called victims. The viewpoints of the cadets themselves can be ascertained by how it was detailed in the annual college journal, and I've shown this on the slide. The key ingredients here was that an external party drew attention to excesses of cadet behaviour, and the military was tasked by its political masters to investigate. This investigation would either find that there was no case to answer, or that a few bad apples had carried things a bit too far and would be disciplined. The cadet body would take umbrage at outsiders criticising aspects of an essentially a self-regulating society that they were not part of and they did not understand. Initially, the initiation ceremony marked the end of the unofficial fourth class training, and so was eagerly awaited by the new cadets. But during a period of the First World War, the first signs of what would later become the systemic harassment of the fourth class cadets began to appear. Open dissent among the junior cadets regarding their mistreatment was minimised by specifically targeting for special attention any cadets who refused to play the game. In 1918, a junior cadet was injured during some fourth class training, spent an extended period in hospital and was forced to repeat the year due to the studies he missed. This incident resulted in the Commandant, Major General Parnell, banning the 1919 initiation ceremony. Parnell was succeeded by Major General Legg in 1920, who rescinded this ban. The importance of the initiation ceremony in the socialisation process of the cadets was such that the intake of the previous year, that's the 1919 year, now in third class, approached the senior classes and stated they did not want to be the only class to go through the college that had not been initiated. Consequently, this class was duly initiated with the 1920 intake. This incident illustrates another common theme that can be discerned when examining the history of bastardisation at Duntroon, that being that prohibitions by the college staff were usually transient, particularly when they were not enforced by all levels of leadership at the college, and that when exposed to the pull of traditions, the former practices of the cadet body reasserted themselves. The initiation ceremony was only able to continue because it had the tacit approval of the college staff. The staff could hardly claim ignorance of what was going on when the cadets built elaborate apparatus with which to conduct the ceremony. And there's a picture from the 1918 initiation ceremony there, which is in the centre of the cadet blocks. Additionally, by the 1920s, many of the junior cadets on the staff were graduates themselves and likely supported the concept of initiation ceremony, having undergone it themselves. By the mid-1920s, life at the college for the fourth class was one long year of torment, and this slide provides some recollections of graduates of the period concerning their treatment by their fellow cadets. Fourth class training, which had originally been approached in a spirit of jest, had now degenerated into systemic mistreatment. Once an humiliating or harassing precedent was established, it would be perpetuated by cadets inflicting the same practice onto the junior cadets in the following year. By the end of the 1920s, the ill treatment of fourth class cadets was a major scandal waiting to happen. But the treatment of junior cadets had degenerated to such an extent was largely due to the absence of staff supervision after hours and during mealtimes. Also, the cadet code prevented junior cadets, upon threat of additional persecution, from complaining of ill treatment to the staff. Isolated by geography and design from the rest of the Canberra community, the college was essentially a closed community that kept its secrets well. This secrecy ended in 1929 when a member of that year's intake wrote to his father complaining that his head had been thrust into a toilet, resulting in a military inquiry being ordered by the Minister for Defence. Following this inquiry, an order was issued by the Commandant, Brigadier Harrison, but there was no fourth class training for 1 month, and that the initiation ceremony was again banned for that year. The senior classes responded by ostracising the entire fourth class for a month, at the end of which fourth class training recommenced with a vengeance as the senior cadets set to make up for lost time. The cadet who started it all by writing to his fathers was discharged after less than a month at the college. This episode illustrates another 2 recurring themes in the history of bastardisation at Duntroon. That being, that if you complain, you only make it worse for yourself and your classmates, and that only cadets who cannot take it, and therefore shouldn't be at Duntroon in the first place, complain to parents or staff about their treatment. In 1964, degree-level academic courses commenced at Duntroon, leading to the establishment of the University of New South Wales Faculty of Military Studies in late 1967. A lecturer at the college would later note that in the pre-degree days of the college, the civil work was less important and less strenuous. Therefore, the hazing of junior cadets and other time-wasting activities did not figure so prominently in the academics' minds. He considered inevitable, however, that the introduction of degree-level academic courses would see an attack launched by the academic staff against its feature of cadet life as being detrimental to their academic performance. In September 1969, less than 2 years after the establishment of the Faculty of Military Studies, a major scandal broke. Its immediate origin lay in a lengthy letter written by a lecturer in the faculty's Department of History, Mr Gerald Walsh, to the Commandant Major General Fraser. While the general tone of the letter was not inflammatory, its contents were. Walsh's concern was prompted by what he saw as a threat to the academic integrity of the college. He pointed out that although in some respects bastardisation could be considered a tradition of a college, this factor in itself did not provide justification for its retention. Additionally, while previous entrants may have experienced bullying or fagging at their secondary schools, this was generally no longer the case. He commented that as a whole, society was moving away from tolerating such practices and called for the eradication of bastardisation at Duntroon. The familiar pattern played out again. A board of inquiry was established and a report provided to the minister. The desire to keep the matter within the confines of the college, however, was shattered in September 1969 when a Canberra-based journalist published a sensationalised account of bastardisation at the college under the provocative title, Duntroon, a Tradition of Torture. A key difference with previous bastardisation scandals that the minister decided upon the formation of an independent inquiry to be chaired by Justice Fox, a justice of the Supreme Court of the ACT, and though not publicised at the time, a 1940 graduate of the college. Their terms of reference was kept as wide as possible in order to examine the whole philosophy underlying fourth class training. Meanwhile, the Commandant took disciplinary action against some officers and some of the senior cadets. This disciplinary action was deeply resented by the cadets as well as being condemned by sections of the general community as well as some of the academic staff. It was felt that an injustice had been committed by punishing cadets and officers for upholding a tradition they themselves had undergone and which had existed at the college since the early 1920s. If they were guilty, then it stood to reason that those that went before them were guilty too. Additionally, elements of the cadet population felt that the punished cadets had been made into scapegoats to appease public opinion for doing little more than continuing a long-standing tradition. The recommendations of the Fox Committee were introduced in revised college policy on the administration and discipline of the cadet body, which was issued in mid-January 1970. This policy stated that fagging of any description would not be tolerated and curtailed the disciplinary powers of senior cadets, so a linkage back to that original order by Bridges in 1911. Following the controversy of 1969, bastardisation temporarily abated at the college, at least in its most extreme forms. By the mid-1970s, however, it was again on the rise, but it morphed into being conducted on a much more individualistic basis. This treatment was dependent more on the personalities of the cadets involved and less on their respective positions in the cadet social order. A 1979 National Times article entitled Men and Honour at Duntroon included a comment from a first class cadet, which encapsulated the methodology behind this more vicious and individualised harassment. He stated pressure is usually placed on the odd man out until he himself realises that he is not officer material. This form of harassment was generally intra-class. A group of cadets would decide, often following some not so subtle suggestions from the senior cadets, that a certain classmate was unlikely to make an effective officer and that they should therefore take it upon themselves to encourage him to resign. Harassment of this nature was often protracted and would generally end with either the cadet resigning or other cadets stepping in to curb the behaviour. We're in this whistle-stop tour of Barsalisation at Duntroon with the events of 1983. The precursor event was the publication of a lengthy article in the Melbourne Age in April titled Officers and Not So Gentlemen, The Brutal Secrets of Duntroon. The sources of these allegations were 3 ex-cadets who had all been members of the college's 1983 intake but had resigned within 5 weeks of arriving. Another inquiry arose with a number of cadets being charged with prejudicial behaviour and 5 cadets being recommended for discharge and were removed from Duntroon. This action by the Commandant, Major General Coates, was overwhelmed by the Minister for Defence, Gordon Scholes, who ascribed more of the blame to a lack of supervision of the cadets by the military staff, and there's some comments he made on the slide there. A number of changes were subsequently introduced by Coates to ensure that the 4th class training did not return to its past practices. Principally, that cadet company commanders would move their officers into the cadets' barracks, and an officer would be present for every meal of cadets' mess. Rigorous staff enforcement of these changes ensured that the old Barsalisation practices did not re-emerge prior to the opening of the Australian Defence Force Academy in 1986 and the ending of what I'll call the old Duntroon. Post-1985, with the opening of ADVA, any remaining vestiges of the old Barsalisation regime at Duntroon died out. This was principally due to 3 factors: the more intensive nature of the new course, the breaking of the Barsalisation nexus, and the changed demographics of the cadet population. The new 18-month course incorporated the military training that was previously spread over 4 years. The intensity of the course and the frequent absence of cadet classes from the college greatly reduced the opportunity for inter-class interaction. Another contributing factor was the breaking of the Barsalisation nexus. Traditionally, the worst bastardisers were the 3rd class, who were seeking retribution for the treatment they had received the year before. The more senior classes had generally lost interest in most of the Barsalisation practices. In 1986, with the opening of ADFA, the only representatives of the old RMC class, the old RMC system left at the college, was 1985 2nd class, now in their final year of training and with little time or enthusiasm to engage in the Barsalisation of new cadets. The January 1986 intake, never having experienced the intensity of the Barsalisation that occurred under the old RMC system, had little motivation to seek retribution on the new cadets when they moved into 2nd class. The final contributing factor was the change in the demographics of the cadet population. Many of the cadets undertaking the 18-month course were older and often more mature in outlook than their predecessors who enrolled in the 4-year course. The presence of female cadets and ex-servicemen and women also introduced a greater degree of maturity among the cadet body, who now came to see many of the practices of the past as juvenile and more appropriate to a single-sex boarding school rather than a mixed general military college. In relation to the broader question of what lessons the Army may take forward arising from this examination of Barsalisation at Duntroon, 2 observations can be made. The military authorities at Duntroon generally only attempted to rein in the excesses of cadet behaviour because of external scrutiny. In many instances, the office involved likely resented and minimised the concerns of external parties by dismissing such concerns as ill-informed and reactive. The military staff could have substantially increased the direct supervision of the cadet body of out of hours, which would have greatly reduced the opportunity for Barsalisation to occur. If they chose not to do so, likely arose from a combination of factors, such as the desire to provide the cadets with some freedom from staff supervision, as well as a recognition that military staff at the college have personal lives as well. But the conclusion is that Barsalisation persisted at the college for so long because many of the military staff felt that boys will be boys, but a bit of toughening up of the cadets would not go astray and that it was a tradition worth preserving. The eradication of Barsalisation at Duntroon pre-1986 would have required significant cultural change enforced by all levels of leadership at the college, from the officers down to the senior cadets, and sustained over an extended period. Due to the opening of ADFA, we will never know if a sustained enforcement of the coach reforms would have seen the end of Barsalisation at Duntroon, or whether it had been simply driven underground, perhaps to have reappeared in a different form at a later date, as it had done so many times in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Some illuminating points there, particularly it's a beloved institution and may have been aware, but not quite aware to that extent of some of the things that went on there, but particularly interested in your point about the external feedback is part of the reason why it was changed. And I think for those of us in the room, we know, particularly when we're talking about a profession, it has to be driven within to change. So look forward to questions we get on that as well. So on that point.
We've got no questions online, so I suggest just take it from the audience.
Rightio. So I invite anyone in the audience that may have a question for the panel. Now is your opportunity. Microphone is coming your way.
Thanks, Trent, and well done moderating so far. I'll get to follow in your footsteps later on today at session 2B here in this theaterette. Gentlemen, thanks very much for a really interesting talk and panel session this morning. My name's Colonel Brendan Robinson, work in Army Headquarters. I'm an engineer, and as an engineer we have a professional body. It's Engineers Australia. They set the standards. It's an independent body for the profession. My wife is a respiratory physician, sleep doctor. She works on the Royal Australian College of Physicians. That particular body has some issues of itself at the moment. But what are your thoughts on having an independent body that oversees the Army profession, such as we have in Engineers Australia or any of the colleges for Australian medical professionals? Thanks.
Anyone want to take that question? Professor?
Sorry, Brendan, I can't see you. Thank you. I think that's not even a choice. I think that is a requirement. It's very difficult to map up professional education standards without the profession itself making them clear. In all of those professions you've listed, those peak bodies exist to make sure education fits the bill. So quite clearly to me, I think that's exactly what Army or Defence more generally should do. What form that body should take within the Army, that's up to you guys. Is it responsibility forces command? I'm not sure, but someone has to be able to tell me, Craig, you're doing it wrong. We want this stuff in the degree tomorrow. That stuff you put in yesterday is no longer relevant. Otherwise, in their absence, we will do what we think's right instead of what you think's right. So the question is absolutely. Sorry, the answer is absolutely to me.
I'll agree with Craig there. In undertaking the research into the current state of the armed profession, it's really very clear with the three different pillars that the Chief of Army has discussed and outlined as being the components of the profession. There's no single responsibility for any of those beyond the personage of the Chief himself. That's the only time when those three pillars come into a single area of responsibility. I'll agree with Craig again. Some kind of body would be useful in helping to coordinate those kinds and understand the requirements of the profession. But it is a difficult prospect, especially given the multiple guises of the Army. It is both a profession, it is a fighting force, and it is a bureaucracy. So any kind of body that seeks to oversee that will need to take into consideration all three senses of it, to my mind.
Thanks for the question, Brendan. In my professional capacity, as opposed to my hobby of being a military historian, I do a lot of work, have in the past, with some of the peak bodies that you've mentioned. One of the concepts, and this is with the theme of the education of a profession they have, is what they call CPD, which is continuing professional development, which, as being an accredited member of the association, there is mandated, recorded and analysed requirements for undertaking a degree of continuing professional development, which generally involves attendance at courses or writing papers whatsoever, and that's applying to all members of that body. So I just posit that as potentially something, continuing your theme, if there was such a body. We've already heard about the Chief of Army reading list and the means taken to embed that into unit training programs, but maybe if there was such a professional accreditation body or education body, that's an aspect they might choose to look at as well.
Hello, my question's for Craig Stocking. My name's Kate Carter. I'm a student of military organisation and culture. I'm over here on your left. Army's worked very hard in recent years to democratise professional military education around the ranks, if you will. But I do note the focus of the new degree at ADFA, and I wonder what you thought the dangers perhaps were of officers being the keepers of the knowledge in the future.
Thanks, Kate. I have an opinion on this issue that's not shared by many people I talk to. I don't agree with the stratification of somehow the officer corps are professionals and the other ranks are tradesmen or any other analogy that's just ridiculous to me. The only reason that I think it's a good thing for a new degree at ADFA is it's a start, it's not an end. Professional education ought to be non-optional for people in uniform. It's part of being in a profession. It's not done once and forgotten. It's returned to at different levels throughout one's career, as is the case in the other professions that I'm aware of. Should professional education of the type I talked about be available to other ranks? I think so. We do a discredit to think not. Perhaps that might be tied to rank level and experience level. Perhaps there is enough experience is gained of the organisation to be ready for that type of education. But I don't believe it is an officer-only activity, and nor can it be so, and nor is that so in any other profession. But as I say, there's plenty of others who disagree. That's my take.
Desmond Woods, Australian Naval Institute, formerly a member of the staff of the Royal Australian Naval College, HMAS Creswell. I've recently been writing a paper on cultural change in the Navy and looking back at the history of the Naval College and other naval training establishments. And I can only echo what Darren has been saying about the bastardisation being the result of lack of engagement by college staff. The reason that the RANC was less susceptible to bastardisation, not unknown, was that it was a much smaller institution, and the daily involvement of divisional officers with the cadets made the kind of practices that went tolerated at Duntroon much less common, not unknown. But the place where it really reared its head was the junior recruit entry at HMAS Lewin in WA, where for some reason senior sailors and the officers who should have interfered stepped back and allowed senior members of the cadet body there, or the junior entry body, to bastardise the juniors. So I think the difference was not so much between Army and Navy as institutions as the way in which we ran those places in decades gone by. I can also concur with the point you made in your slide that the introduction of women into those cadet bodies was a major factor in limiting the kind of male-only muscular idiocy that went on decade after decade. The late, much lamented Admiral James Goldrick confided in me that there was a time when he wasn't sure whether his naval career could survive. He was a slightly built, very intellectual young man who was not welcomed by all for just those reasons. One can only speculate on the number of very fine careers that were cut short by the kind of bastardisation that went on in Duntroon and the intellectual impoverishment of the Army in later generations by this foolish practice of allowing public school mores to infiltrate into a military college.
Great question, Desmond. So we've probably got time for one more.
Thanks, sir. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your presentations. Nick Floyd, Australian Army. Question, I guess, for Darren, and great to see you again. You've mentioned that bastardisation has obviously turned up time and time again throughout Duntroon's history, and you've alluded to it being exhibited in many other institutions as well. But I guess I'm interested in a deeper, more profound question, because these sorts of things have been happening since the Spartans used to do similar things to each other, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. Why does it keep coming up? And is there actually a value there that we're not seeing? You know, obviously, as a graduate myself, I was subjected to that myself, and obviously there's lots of negative aspects. But are there any kernels of positivity that can be brought out from such behaviours?
Great question, Nick. I'll just reflect on it for a moment. So, in relation to, I'll take the last bit of your question first. In relation to, is there anything positive that comes out of it? While some may argue that there's in relation to the bonding of a class, in that those that have experienced sort of extreme training, they may have a stronger bond of comradeship. So some might say, well, this is something that came out of these kind of practices, and you alluded to the intense bonds between the Spartans. But I would posit that there's other ways of achieving that as well. So you can have, any positive outcomes were probably not the intent of these practices, but probably more arose out of a happenstance. So in relation to sort of like, and my talk was specifically in relation to what I called the old Duntroon, pre the opening of ADFA. If people are interested and wish to sort of explore this topic more fully, I would recommend that there's a couple of publications or a couple of reports that you might want to look at. Probably starting off with the report of the 2024 Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, in particular Volume 3, Chapters 9 and 10, look at some of the cultural underpinnings for this behaviour over a longitudinal period and steps to address it. Going back further, there is a series of reports written from 2011 to 2014 by Elizabeth Broderick, who was the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner, who was looking at the impacts of culture and attempts to address the culture, and also, to your question, looking at were there any positive aspects and why was it allowed to continue?
Ladies and gentlemen, that's time. And as I mentioned at the start, been in the Army for a while. I like timings. So for those of you who came by mistake, thank you for staying. For those of you who came, you now agree with me that we were not the B-side. So if I can ask you to put your hands together for Professor Craig Stockings, Dr. Jordan Beavis and Dr. Darren Moore.